And it looks like we have people from all over the United States and Jamaica and the Philippines, Mexico. So a really great audience here. So if you wanted to go ahead and, are you going to present slides on your screen?
Yes, I have slides. How do I do that? Share screen?
Yep, and then a lot of times there's questions in the chat box, so I'll be trying to answer those, and then if you don't mind, or if you're open to me potentially interrupting you with questions, then we might.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, great.
Sounds good. All right. What is the share screen on the PowerPoint slides or on my background right now?
It's on the PowerPoint slides.
Okay, good. I don't need you guys to be looking at my dog the whole time. All right, let me put in the slides. All right. Beginning. Everything look good?
Looks great.
All right, so there's a picture of me. I didn't know if there'd be video or not, so just ignore that. I cut my hair. So as Danielle said, I'm at the School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, and we are located in Baltimore, Maryland in the US. And so our center specifically is an academic center located in the School of Public Health, and we focus on education, research, communications, and policy that all are at the intersection of food systems, the environment, and public health. And so we really, because we are a university in public health in an urban environment in the US, a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today is really from that perspective. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of examples that are specific to the US and often in an urban context, but I hope that this will kind of give you an idea of some of what's going on more at the local level in terms of connecting food with climate change and then doing something about climate change through actions related to food. But I know that there are a lot of people on this call who are from other countries, and so I really welcome questions and discussion from other perspectives as well. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to give a quick summary of what I'm talking about when I talk about food systems. I'll go into how food systems is related with climate change, and then I'll talk about 4 different ways to, as I like to say, take a bite out of climate change, or in particular, reduce greenhouse gas emissions through food actions. So, food systems. So food systems are, if you're not as familiar with it, it's really all of the people, the processes, the systems, and the infrastructure that are important for feeding a population from the farm all the way to the table and to consumers and to waste. And so the diagram that I'm showing here really shows the different key stages of a food supply chain, from production to consumption and waste. But I think it's important when you think about food systems to think about all of these different stakeholders who grow, process, distribute, eat, waste food, and think about them existing in a broader environment. So a social and economic environment, a natural environment, and because it's a system, all of these different environments and people and processes all interact with one another. So when we talk about food systems, it's often difficult to separate out one piece. And so in a similar way, I think the climate and food are very very linked. And so it's difficult to talk about food without talking about climate change and vice versa, from where I'm standing. So the food and climate connection. So I hope that most of you or all of you already know that we expect climate change to have some pretty significant impacts on food production, or already we're seeing impacts from more severe weather, drought, and temperature changes. So we expect to see a pretty big impact on food production in terms of less crop production in certain latitudes that might, impact food security. We could also see different trade patterns between the North and South. If people in the North are less impacted and more able to produce food, that might shift trade. We might see increased water scarcity, which again could impact food insecurity and then also maybe lead to conflict, or already is doing that. With a warmer ocean, we could see more acidification and a decline in wild fishery yields. And so there's a lot of impacts on production of food, but one of the things that I focus on specifically in my research and in my work here is kind of beyond the farm. Once that food is produced, how is climate impacting our ability to distribute it to people and for people to access it? So we also expect supply chain disruptions. So if you have flooding in a city and roads are all covered in water, how does that impact your ability to truck food in from a rural agricultural community to get to populations in a city, for example? And so there are a lot of other, of course, impacts on the food system from climate change, and I'd be happy to talk about that more at another time, but what I'm really going to focus on today is how the food system impacts climate change. So like flipping the side of climate here. So there are different estimates, but in general, a typical thing you'll hear is that the food system globally contributes 19 to 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And that includes land use change and production and a number of different things that are related to food systems. And then 14.5% of that is estimated to be specifically from livestock production, processing, and transportation of livestock. So animals play a pretty big role in greenhouse gas emissions from food in particular. And as hopefully you've heard, beef is a pretty big per unit emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, especially methane, through enteric fermentation, which is basically cow burps and farts. So of the foods that we're eating globally, beef is a pretty big contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is, good to know on its own, but then when you think about global projections of population growth and, if incomes rise in different countries and different populations have more money to spend in the next few decades, we expect that they also will be increasing demand for animal foods. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. We have a couple of questions about the last slide.
Sure.
If you don't mind going back, or
Sure.
the pie chart.
Yep.
So the first one is that transportation of livestock only, not produce or value add? So I think what's being asked is, I think, is the transportation part of the livestock? I don't know. Maybe I can unmute and you can clarify that question for us. And then the other one is, what does the other sectors include of the pie chart?
Okay.
Because I think the livestock portion of the pie chart is just the eating and the living of livestock, right?
So it depends on what estimate you're looking at. I've actually been looking into this recently. So the 14.5% is the FAO's, Food and Agriculture Organization's estimates. And so that includes, I actually wrote down the notes here. So so digestion and essentially the burps, the actual methane coming out of the livestock, as well as manure and manure management, which also emits GHGs, and then producing feed to feed the livestock, and then like processing and transporting meat, milk, and eggs. So the FAO estimate is, I think, a little bit more inclusive than I think the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's estimate, which the number looks a little bit lower because they attribute certain parts of it, like transportation, to other sectors. So yeah, that's a great question because it all kind of depends on how you're counting it. When you hear, oh, livestock contributes as much greenhouse gases as transportation, it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. And the other sectors include, I think the main one is energy, of course, and then I'm trying to remember specifically what the other ones are. Oops, go back. But yeah, I think it's mostly energy, but I don't remember exactly what the other ones are.
Okay.
So
thank you.
Yep. So so livestock plays a pretty big role in greenhouse gas emissions, and we expect to see the demand for animal products going up in the coming decades. So FAO estimated that we could see 73% more demand for meat by 2050, and a lot of that growth is going to happen in developing countries because, as I said, as we see rising incomes, we expect to see more animal consumption. But there could still be a slower rise in more developed countries. And that's not, in itself a bad thing. There are lots of people in the world who don't have enough nutrients right now, and eating more animal products is a good way to get those nutrients that they need to be healthy. But from a climate perspective, it's definitely something that we are going to need to address through both improving reducing the emissions intensity of raising animal products, and then also by trying to curb that demand for more products. So I will go on. So another important kind of contributor from the food sector, and another thing that I work on, is food waste. So this is a graph from the FAO, and it's actually based on a report by the World Resources Institute, and they found that if food wastage were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. So all of the food that's wasted in the world, which is about a third of what is produced right now, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions because when it goes to a landfill or decomposes somewhere, it emits methane. But then also, if you're producing food and processing and transporting it, and then it's not being used, that's essentially wasted emissions in a way, because those emissions that were kind of used up from the emissions budget for wasted food could have been kind of allocated somewhere else. So it's a smaller part of total emissions than livestock and even other parts of the agriculture and food systems, but it's still pretty significant, and it's an issue that many people are already trying to address around the world, and so it really kind of lines up well with climate action as well. So, no surprise, the things I'm going to talk about next are really focused on this demand side of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, and a little bit of kind of explanation on why I'm going to focus on the demand side. So in the graph that I'm showing here, the bar on the left side is basically in 2010 the emissions from all sectors, and agriculture is a piece of that. But by 2050, if we continue the agricultural practices that we have now, and if we do see the increase in demand as I described, it's estimated that the agricultural emissions are going to take up almost all of the emissions budget, essentially, that we have to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, which is the Paris Agreement goal. So if we don't do anything with agriculture, we're not going to have any room for emissions in any other sector in 2050, essentially. So it's important to address agriculture to begin with. But then why look at the demand side? Because, you know, there are more and more kind of technological ways of improving efficiency and practices for producing food that can reduce emissions, right? And so, like in the US, for example, we have a very efficient system for producing livestock, although there are other public health and environmental consequences of that system. But per unit, we have a very efficient system. So the idea is that in other countries, you know, if they have more technology, they can reduce their emissions while still producing more food. But there have been some studies that have come out, and this picture here is an example of that, where even if we close those yield gaps and have improved technology for growing food and raising livestock, we still expect to see an overall increase in agricultural emissions. But if we also reduce demand for meat and dairy and reduce waste, we can keep that ag emissions kind of in check and leave space for other sectors. So it's important to look at the supply side of agriculture, but also the demand side when thinking about solutions and food systems. So are there questions before I go on?
No, not at the moment. I think a lot of people, they want to save them for the end.
Okay, great.
But if anything pops up, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I know I might be talking kind of fast and going over a lot, so.
Yeah, you're fine.
All right, so that's kind of a quick overview of the issues as I see it and some of the problems and challenges that we're facing relating to food and climate change from the side of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So what can we do about that? I wanted to focus on more kind of local level actions that people can take to kind of address some of these problems because it can be a bit overwhelming. And at federal levels and at international levels, it's a very slow moving boat in terms of seeing change in agriculture and food systems when it comes to climate. So I'm just going to go over kind of 4 ideas for what people can do to reduce emissions through food. So the first one is eat more plants, but more specifically, people who already eat too many animal foods and that are in some ways detrimental for public health should try to eat more plants and eat less beef in particular. And as you can see in the map here, like the US, for example, is one of the top 10 countries in terms of meat consumption per capita. I think we, on average, we eat 2 to 3 times more meat than the global average. So we have a lot of consumption here that's not needed necessarily. I mean, we also have non-communicable diseases like cardiovascular diseases that are in part diet related. So we have health problems in our country in part because of what we're eating, and we're eating too much. Meanwhile, there are people in other countries who are not getting enough. So it's important to think about, it's not about everyone becoming vegan in the world. It's about people who are eating too much need to stop eating so much, and think a little bit more about what types of animal foods they are eating when they're eating them. And again, I say less beef because, as I showed in the graph before, that's one of the highest emitting, or the highest emitting foods. So it's difficult to just say, oh, change what you're eating. It's pretty clear that it's difficult for people to change behavior, and extremely difficult to change food behavior. So instead of just asking people to change, there are a number of things that are going on in the US and in other countries that are looking at how to use policies and kind of more broader programs to make it easier for people to make these changes. So the Good Food Purchasing Program is, I think, a really great example of this. So this program was started in Los Angeles, California, in 2012, and basically in their public school district, they said, we want to improve the food that we're serving to our students, and so we want to make sure that the people from are practicing growing practices that align with our values. And so those values were, they wanted to support local food, food that was environmentally sustainable, food that was reflective of fair labor practices, so good for the workers who are growing the food, food that's humane to animals, and then food that is healthy and nutritious for the students. So the Good Food Purchasing Program, it's basically a rating system. So schools get rated on how they, on their food purchases by these 5 different categories. And so it's not just focused on climate change, it's a broader approach to serving good food to students. But in the environmental sustainability category, they ask schools to reduce their menu items that have a high carbon and water footprint using strategies such as plant-forward menus that feature smaller portions of animal proteins in a supporting role. So again, it's not saying we're going to just serve vegan and vegetarian food to all of our students. It's saying, we're going to have more plants in our menus and kind of rethink how animal proteins are make up the whole meal. And this had pretty big impact because in the Los Angeles school district, they estimate they serve 750,000 meals per day. And they did a study of the impact on their program and found that there was a 15% decrease in meat spending, and they saved 19.6 million gallons of water per week. And both of those things were due to cutting out meat once a week through the Meatless Monday program, which I'll talk about in a second. So it was a pretty successful program, and they're now expanding to institutions like schools and cities around the US. So they've been adopted or are working to get adopted in 16 cities around the US, according to their recent numbers. And this is something that it started in a school district, but in different cities in the US, it can be something that local community members have kind of formed coalitions to bring the Good Food Purchasing Program to their city or to their school. So it can start at a community level, but it's a kind of a rating system and incentive program that is used in many different places. So it's becoming more of kind of a national thing. So that's one example of how food procurement can be used as a tool for shifting diets towards having more plants and less animal foods on the menu. Another thing that I mentioned was Meatless Monday. So my organization, the Center for Livable Future, is the technical advisor to Meatless Mondays. So we we do research and provide the research support and evidence behind the Meatless Monday campaign. So the goal of Meatless Mondays is just one day a week cut out meat, and they want to reduce meat consumption 15% for human and planetary health. And so the program started back in 2002 here at Johns Hopkins, and it was really focused on public health. So again, recognizing that a lot of Americans probably eat too much meat, that's, for what's good for their health. But recently they've also been focusing on the environmental and climate benefits as well, recognizing this need for broader dietary shifts. And why Monday? It's Meatless Monday because Monday has been shown to be a day when a lot of people are more likely to make commitments and try something new to improve their health or well-being. So it's kind of a motivating day. And this is something that, again, is not a top-down thing where the Monday campaigns, which is the kind of parent organization, goes in places and says, hey, we want you to do Meatless Monday. It's something where local communities or schools have their own kind of local programs. And so there's some version of Meatless Monday in more than 40 different countries now. And they're kind of tailored to different country contexts, so cultural context, different languages, etc. And then I just wanted to share one more specific example of a community who's done Meatless Monday. So there's a community in New York State, Bedford, and they have their own climate commitment. So they, as a community, committed to reducing their carbon emissions 20% by 2020. And so their pledge included all different sectors like energy, food and agriculture, and transportation. But for their food and agriculture component of their goals, they decided to try to get members of the community to do Meatless Monday for 12 weeks. In 2018, they had 320 different households who gave up meat one day a week. And then we helped them measure the carbon footprint of that work. So they reduced collectively 22,894 kilograms of CO2 emissions. So, that's not a huge number in relation to global emissions, but it's been a good example of how a community can mobilize and take this type of tool and campaign and make it work for their community, and how we can help them connect that to broader climate goals and see what their impact can be. So are there any questions on that before I go on to the next section?
Nothing yet. Everybody's pretty quiet. Although I didn't realize that the Meatless Monday started all the way back in 2002. So that's really great.
Yeah, it's been around a while.
Cool.
Okay. All right. So I'm sure there's probably going to be questions and discussion on the eat more plants and less meat. But I do want to talk about some examples of what people are doing to waste less food.
Erin, sorry, a question did just pop up asking, do you have a link of that carbon footprint calculator? So how do you calculate that?
Yeah, so I don't think we have a link. So our institutions actually just made a big kind of tool and data set to do this type of thing and calculate carbon emissions and also water footprint per using like country-specific data. We haven't published that yet, so we don't necessarily have a tool that we can share with everyone, but I know that there are other organizations that have done something like that. So I can kind of look for that information and I can share it with whoever's interested after this, if you would like that.
Yeah, another person asked for a list of the resources where these initiatives have been published and discussed in more detail. So yeah, if you could provide links and references, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. I can send out like a follow-up after this with some more information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so now I'm going to move on to talk about wasting less food. So in the U.S., the Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency created what's called the food recovery hierarchy. And so this is basically a way that we prioritize what to do with food waste or how to reduce food waste. Before I go into that, I do want to say, so I mentioned that a third of the food produced in the world is wasted, but it's not all wasted in the same way. So typically in higher income countries with more, established supply chains, a lot of the waste is at the consumer and retail level. So in the US, that's where most of our waste is. But in lower income countries, most of that waste is happening on the farm and in the supply chain. And for various reasons, some of it is due to like a lack of refrigeration and different other practices. So my work doesn't necessarily focus on the on-farm waste and supply chain waste. We really focus on how to get consumers to waste less and also stores. Just to set the situation here, so the diagram here is this food recovery hierarchy. And so you'll see at the top that source reduction, or just preventing waste to begin with, is the most preferred way of addressing food waste. And then the thing we're trying to avoid is, letting food go to landfills, because that could be food that people could be eating. And also, from a greenhouse gas perspective, you want to avoid those emissions in the landfill, and also wasted emissions from producing and processing that food. So I'm going to go through a few examples from different levels of this hierarchy. So the first one is source reduction. So I know this presentation is titled Food Policy, but I'm looking at policy very loosely. So there's a campaign called the Save the Food campaign, which is led by the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Ad Council in the U.S. And it's a consumer-facing campaign trying to raise Americans' awareness about food waste, how much they waste, and what kind of resources are wasted when they waste food. So they have this, it's a kind of a media campaign, and there are posters and billboards with kind of messages like the one on the slide here. But then they also have been partnering with cities around the U.S. to implement these campaigns within their cities. So here in Baltimore, the last year or so, Baltimore has been partnering with the Save the Food campaign to do that here. So it's a education and awareness campaign, but then they also have a website where they have all sorts of tips for consumers on how to reduce their waste. So kind of clarifying information about when it's safe to throw away food, proper food storage, what date labels mean, which in many cases they don't mean much here. So it's like an education campaign focused specifically on consumers. And so they reported, they kind of evaluated their campaign and saw that in the first year, 64% of the people who saw the ads said that they waste less food. And that was compared to 38% of people who said they waste less food among those who hadn't seen the ads. So that's, might point to the success of this educational campaign, although there are many other factors that could have kind of fed into that result. So that's an example of kind of consumer-facing efforts to reduce waste and prevent it in the home. Another thing that's happening all over the U.S. is food recovery. There are nonprofit organizations and other groups popping up all over the place that are taking food that could still be eaten, but for some reason may go to waste, and then taking it and giving it to people who don't have enough food. So mostly food rescue. So they rescue it from a catering event, for example, and then take it to a food pantry or a soup kitchen, where then that food is served to people. And so one example of this is the Food Recovery Network. And this is a network of basically college groups at university levels around the US who again, are taking food from catering events and serving it and sharing it with people who need it. And this group has really grown just exponentially in the last few years, and it's really caught on. And they said that they recovered 3.4 million pounds of food, donated 2.9 million meals, and prevented 6.4 million kilograms of CO2 emissions. And I just want to point out that those estimates and the estimates that I'm sharing here are typically reported by the organization. And it's one of the things that we really need in all of these examples and in this world of food action and climate change is better measurement. There are a lot of things popping up and organizations doing this great work, and not a lot of it is being evaluated. So we hope that it's having a good impact on climate, but we don't know for sure to what extent. So that's something that I'm hoping to do more of in the future. And then finally, I wanted to talk about composting. So that's further down on the food recovery hierarchy. So, not as ideal from an emissions perspective as just preventing waste, but still better than going to a landfill. And composting food also can feed back into the production of future food. So one policy that has been somewhat successful in diverting food from landfills to composting facilities is a law from 2014 in Massachusetts, where they banned the disposal of commercial food waste, essentially. So waste coming from businesses, larger institutions like schools, is not allowed to go to the landfill, essentially. And they did an assessment of the economic impact of that, and as you'll see in the graph here, after the ban was implemented, they saw a significant increase in food being diverted from landfills to people who could process that food waste. So it went more into composting than in the landfills. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. That's why the line is going up. It's not a reduction in waste. It's an increase in diversion from landfills. So since they adopted that ban, there have been, I believe, other states and jurisdictions who have adopted similar policies as a way to address food waste. So I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions on food waste?
Nothing so far on food waste, although there are a lot of people that do hope to get your slides after this. So I've taken down their email addresses. Yeah, so it seems like there's a lot of interest, but they want time to digest everything.
Yeah.
Not pun intended.
Yeah, no, I know I'm going over a lot. There's a lot going on, so it's good that this is a problem. All right, so the last two things I'm going to talk about of the 4 ways to take a bite out of climate change are a little bit, they're more on the urban planning and policy side of things. So one thing, as I said earlier, that's really needed is to measure it, and to measure the impact of all of these different interventions and how much they're actually contributing to greenhouse gas and climate mitigation. So that's a big research need right now. We need more value interventions. But another thing that's missing, that I think is missing, and that should be a bigger part, at least, of local climate policy and climate planning, is just measuring the emissions, the indirect emissions from food consumption. So the way that the International Climate Agreement and national level greenhouse gas inventories, the way that's set up is based on production-based emissions. So that's within your geographic boundaries and your jurisdiction. What is being produced? What are the emissions that are produced in that boundary? So given that in cities in particular, there's not much food being produced in the city, yet most people in the world live in cities and eat in cities, just looking at what's produced in a city isn't really getting the full impact of an urban population's climate impact. So there's something called the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventories, or GPC. And this is a protocol that many cities are using to measure their emissions and to be able to track their progress on reducing their climate emissions or greenhouse gas emissions over time. And so these local level inventories can feed into national level inventories, which can give countries as well as cities a sense of their progress on meeting their climate goals. But right now, most cities only look at scope 1 emissions, which is that stuff that's really produced within the city boundaries. And they're not looking at scope 3, which would include those indirect emissions from things that are being consumed in the city. So basically what a city's eating, or what the city's residents are eating, unless they are eating something that they grew themselves or that was grown in the city, those emissions aren't really being counted. And so this is kind of a detailed graph, but the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group came out with a report a year or two ago, and they looked at the consumption-based emissions of 79 cities around the world who are part of this C40 group. And they found that in some regions of the world, they found that most of the cities, or 80% of the cities they studied, had higher consumption-based emissions than production-based emissions. So for those cities, if they really want to make an impact on climate, it kind of makes sense to look at their consumption-based emissions as well as what they're producing. But that really differs by region. Oh, my stars and boxes got messed up. But basically, they broke down the cities based on which regions they're located in, and then what the different categories of products being consumed are, and their percent of their emissions. So you can see in North America and Europe, for example, food, this kind of one of the blue bars here, food, beverages, and tobacco are the largest category of emissions based on what people are consuming in that cities in that region. So that's why food could be something that benefits from this more consumption-based emissions accounting and really getting at the emissions from food. And I do want to say there aren't many cities who have looked at this, but there are some examples. Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington are two of them. Portland, they both did these consumption-based inventories, but they did different things with the results. So Portland said, we're going to actually set some more concrete policy goals for reducing consumption of carbon-intensive foods and reducing waste, and that was included in their climate action plan. And it was framed in a way that made it seem like the city itself would be kind of actively trying to support that dietary shift. Versus Seattle included their emissions, and they said, yes, food consumption is an important part, but they kind of framed it as, consumers, residents, this is something that you should be doing to reduce your impact by going meat-free 1 day a week. So they frame it in different ways, and maybe the follow-up policies or actions might be different, but they both started off, by saying, what are these emissions from what we're eating? And that led them to make these suggestions. And then finally, I've talked a lot about what cities are doing. I said we work in an urban environment. Unfortunately, food often gets left out of the conversation when thinking about planning and climate action planning. But we're seeing more and more local governments in the US and in Canada coming up with sustainability plans that have a pretty robust food component, and now climate action plans that really do talk about food and climate. And that includes not only mitigation actions, but also supporting adaptation and resilience in the food system, which is something that I've worked on, but I'm not going to talk about that today because I don't have time. But I just want to say that the city of Cincinnati recently came out with a report, basically their sustainability plan in 2018, and they had a pretty comprehensive goals for food. And one of their goals was in the next 5 years to double the number of people eating plant-based diets, and then also to reduce food waste by 20% by 2025. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at their plan and kind of see how they framed food. It was very kind of comprehensive, and there are climate and diet shifts in there, but it's not the main focus. It's kind of recognizing that there are many different strategies for supporting sustainability and climate action through food. And then, like I said, there are also there's kind of a growing group of cities who are looking at food in terms of climate resilience as well. So if anyone here is interested in that side of the climate issue and wants to learn more about what cities are doing, I'm happy to share resources on that as well after the call. So that's kind of my four key areas that we can, from a local level, take a bite out of climate change. Although that's not an exhaustive list, and there's still a lot more work to do. If you are interested in this, though, my colleague wrote a great blog post about this on our center's blog in 2017 that was basically saying, what can food policy councils do for climate change? And there's an even longer list on that blog post of what people can do. So take a look at that as well. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions and discuss more of this now if anyone wants to.
Great, thank you. So does anybody have any questions? You can type them in the chat and I can relay them to Erin, or I can try to unmute people as they have questions. I know everybody wants links to the resources, so they're really interested in what's available, even the city climate action plans. So Laura, to answer your question about cities' climate action plans, usually you can Google most of those. But, you know, I wasn't aware that Cincinnati really incorporated food into their sustainability plan, which is really great. So I plan to take a look at that.
And a note on Cincinnati. So it came to my attention because they just did a webinar. I think the Ohio Food Policy Council had a webinar with Cincinnati and Cleveland just a couple of weeks ago. And they talked about what they're doing with food in their climate action plans. And I wasn't able to attend the webinar, but I've heard from multiple people that it was great. And they wanted to follow up with Cincinnati. So I'm trying to figure it out if I can get a recording of that, if anyone's interested in some more specific examples, but I can add that to the list if anyone's interested.
Okay. And then Brittany was wondering if you know of any studies from Central and South America.
Studies on like these same things. I mean, there is lots of research in other countries. I think my work is focused on the US, so a lot of the examples I have, or all of the examples, are from the US.
Okay. And I think that FAO probably has the most robust research in terms of other things that are happening in other countries, but it may not be exactly from the systems perspective. And
yeah.
And then there was also that Lancet report that came out with EAT, in partnership with EAT. So yeah. Again, and I think I've gotten most people's email addresses, so I'll be able to send out Erin's slides, a link to the recording on YouTube, and then some of the other reports that I've mentioned. And Guy was wondering if you were aware of any research regarding changing the diet of cows so as to reduce the amount of methane that they burp and fart out.
Yes, there is research on that. Actually, I think it was last year, but I was looking into I think certain types of seaweed, if you feed them certain types of seaweed, they emit less methane. So there's definitely research going on in that field. I'm not an expert on it. And that's something that also hopefully we can figure out that can reduce overall emissions, but I don't have specific examples.
I did hear Mike from our institute mention that if you feed them garlic, it reduces the methane.
Really?
He makes the joke that then the milk tastes like salad dressing. So,
oh, yeah.
Let's see, another question. How are cities like Portland measuring that 20% more people are eating more plants, etc.?
That's a good question. Look at the slides real quick. 20%. Or you mean Cincinnati?
Maybe that, yeah. Maybe.
Oh, it was Cincinnati. That's a good question. I would have to look more into the plan. The thing is, well, one thing to note about plans is that they're plans. So you can have something that's written in a climate action plan, but yeah, it needs to be paired with, a concrete strategy for implementing it and a way to measure it. So I don't know exactly how they're measuring it, but hopefully they are. But I would try to look into that plan specifically to see, because I think they probably measure it in different ways.
Great. Let's see. Brittany was wondering if there's any page or campaign that we can use to share the Meatless Monday initiative.
Yes, actually, they are launching their global platform. So like I said, it's Meatless Monday is in 40 plus countries now. So I don't know if it's officially out yet, but they've developed an online platform where people all over the world working on this can connect and get more resources, and including the resources about Meatless Monday. But Meatless Monday does have a website with specific resources as well.
Great. Let's see. Manna was wondering if there were any new efforts being talked about in the Farm Bill, or is this still only on a city level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of my colleagues are focusing on the Farm Bill. And I think where climate comes in is in like the conservation title in the Farm Bill, which I'm not sure of the details on that. It doesn't talk about like diet shifts necessarily. But one of the things that I haven't talked about is kind of the underlying and structural reasons also why, like in the US, we have an abundance of animal products and meat, right? And the Farm Bill it definitely supports specific commodities, which often are feed for animals like corn and soy. And there's there's less support for what's called specialty crops, which is fruits and vegetables and some of the foods that we need to be eating more of. So that's one thing that I've heard about a lot in terms of how to kind of make this change in the Farm Bill is to look at supports for different commodities and think about, is support going to continue the system that we have that's enabling a lot of very cheap meat, or is it going to be supporting more diverse foods and more plant-based proteins and fruits and vegetables? So
yeah,
good question.
I'm fielding questions from multiple areas, so it's kind of let's see. Lisa says the Philippines is an agricultural country, but droughts are becoming the norm, resulting to damage to crops, leading to limited supply of veggies and fruits. So how can I influence or convince people to shift to a plant-based diet given the scenario? Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult scenario. I think access to food is probably the critical concern there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's I don't have a good answer for that, but I think that's why it's important when we talk about diet shifts to make it clear that it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, not that it's easy anywhere, but depending on the context and the country and the challenges you're facing, it may not be an easy option or the right option in some cases. But I feel like that would also be, there's a connection to adaptation and some of the efforts on the adaptation and resilience side, because, we don't need to just reduce our emissions from agriculture. We also are going to have to make sure that our agriculture and our systems can withstand climate change. And so, finding a way to produce foods in that new climate that continue to provide like diverse sources of food is another challenge, I think. That's kind of, other side of the coin, but we need all of this on both sides of climate. It's a big challenge. So
yeah, it is. And then, sorry, there's a lot of questions now. And hopefully you still have time to stick around for a couple more minutes. So I think this is it Klaus or Clow said, I didn't entirely understand the slide measure it. How relevant is food waste in the global total compared to transport or energy, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's food waste compared to transport and energy is small. Relatively, it's not a big thing. But I think it's also a good entry point in some ways for talking about how food is contributing to climate change. Because, in the kind of international climate policy arena, I think a lot of the focus has been on adaptation and resilience, which is very important. But when you talk about how to mitigate emissions from food systems, starting with let's eat less meat is not necessarily the best entry point in some situations. But if you can say, hey, this is important, but also we're wasting food, and if we can solve the waste problem, we can also work with, it can also be a way to mitigate emissions. So I think in a political sense, it's a good entry point, but it is also still significant. I mean, if you think about, the statistic of the third largest country, or it would be the third largest emitting country by emissions if food waste was all pooled together, that's pretty significant. So it's definitely not something to ignore. And I think it's part of the solutions and kind of the whole box of solutions that are needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see. Another one is from Maggie. Many agriculture proponents say that practice is the only way we can meet the increasing protein demands of a growing population. How do you feel about that statement and agriculture as a whole, especially if done as sustainably as possible, and it encourages people to eat more local, healthy food?
Sorry, what was the first part of that sentence?
Just saying many people that support aquaculture say that it's the only way we can meet increasing protein demands for the global population.
Yeah. So we do need to meet increasing demands. I mean, and I think I said this earlier, like we need both better ways of producing food that are more, less emissions intensive, but we also need to address the demand issue. I think we can't solve the problem only by focusing on demand or only by focusing on supply side changes.
Yeah, we gotta do everything we possibly can, I guess.
Yeah.
So April lives in Cincinnati and knows that they've started an effort to have residents register whether they have pollinator gardens. So she's wondering if it'll be something similar regarding levels of food waste, but she hasn't read the full plan yet. Yeah, maybe.
Sorry, somebody keeps calling. That's a good question. I don't know.
And then Guy was wondering, do you know where we can safely purchase ground mealworms as protein alternative that has much less carbon impact?
Where can you purchase ground worms?
Ground mealworms.
Oh, ground mealworms.
Protein alternative. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I, even knowing all this information, I don't know if I'm ready to start eating mealworms. But Guy, if you find a source, let us know, because if you tasted them, let us know. That would be interesting.
I know there are like insects. There's some research going on about how to get more people in like the US to eat insects as an alternative protein, because we don't typically eat insects here. And that kind of goes back to the other ways of getting protein beyond, eating meat.
Yeah. Let's see. Brittany was wondering about your public policy background. There's something that can be done to have. Is there something that can be done to have sponsors for the management of waste?
What do you mean by that?
I think maybe she's wondering, is there a way to get more people involved in public policy for encouraging more management of food waste?
I mean, there are more and more people who are involved in it. And I think, kind of like I said earlier, I think it's a pretty politically palatable issue. It's not that controversial so far, so it's kind of a good starting point to get people from, you know, both sides of the aisle, different parties on board. Like the federal goal, like the US has a goal of reducing food waste 50% by 2030. And so we don't know how we're measuring that yet, but that's a goal that the federal government has gotten on board with. And it started in the Obama presidency, and now President Trump also kind of endorsed that not too long ago. So it's, so far it hasn't been that hard to get, I think, political support for it at the local level, and also in terms of sponsoring bills in the federal government. Like there have been some bills to address food date labeling. So when food goes bad, trying to have more standardized federal labeling. And there have been some bipartisan bills introduced in Congress to try to make a federal label to reduce waste that way. So.
Nice. Yeah, hopefully that happens. And then, let's see, from Natasha, she says, forgive me if I missed this. The largest part of the greenhouse gas emissions from food waste comes from transportation and not landfill emissions?
I don't know that it's transportation necessarily. I think it would probably depend on the food in terms of the breakdown. Because if you're wasting vegetables versus beef, you know, you're wasting different levels of emissions. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think we got everybody's questions. And as I mentioned, I'll be able to send out information, resources, slides, everything once I get all that pulled together. I have everybody's email address. I put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to connect anybody with Erin. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This was great.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll pull together what I have and send it to you. So thanks all for the questions, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone directly if you want to learn more.
Great. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.